The bush was thick, swallowing the compound like a secret nature had no intention of giving up. Machetes cut through vines and weeds as sweat dripped from the laborers' foreheads. Then silence. A rusted Volkswagen Golf emerged from the undergrowth like a fossil, its windows clouded with years of dust. Moments later, a shout split the air. "Come and see." A group of landlords rushed to the open window of the house. Inside, on a bed that looked frozen in time, lay a skeleton. The room smelled of dust, medicine, and abandonment. 4 years of questions had just been answered, yet the discovery only raised darker mysteries. If you are new to this channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like this video, and comment where you are watching from. The year was drawing to a close, that strange liminal period when 2019 was quietly surrendering itself to 2020. In the small community tucked inside Oyo State, life was slow and predictable. Children played barefoot in sandy streets, their laughter mixing with the hum of evening generators. Women gathered at roadside kiosks, bargaining over tomatoes, yams, and pepper, while men leaned against motorcycles discussing politics and the rise of fuel prices. And then there was the house at the edge of the community, the one with the high walls, iron gate, and bush that seemed to grow faster than anywhere else. Inside that compound lived a man known to some, forgotten by most, Mr. John. To his neighbors he was more mystery than man. He greeted politely, but conversations with him never stretched beyond the usual pleasantries. He was tall, slightly stooped with age, gap-toothed, his voice low and careful, as if every word cost him effort. The children never dared knock on his gate while playing, and even adults spoke of him with a kind of wary respect. In December of 2019, whispers started circulating. Mr. John had been gone for weeks. The few who managed to interact with him recalled his parting words. "I'm traveling. I'll be back," he had told them. At the time, nobody thought much of it. After all, John was known for moving about. An engineer by trade, he had spent years working in the port, where ships docked heavy with cargo. His work, they said, took him back and forth, and his absences had never been unusual. This one, however, felt different. Weeks turned into months. His phones, 2 numbers the community knew, stopped ringing through. At first, neighbors assumed he had simply chosen to extend his stay wherever he had traveled. But as 2020 dawned, unease began to creep into conversations. At landlord meetings, someone would occasionally ask, "Where is Engineer John? Has anyone heard from him?" The answer was always the same. No one knew. His house remained closed, his car unseen, his compound slowly overtaken by weeds. But the community was used to minding their own business. After all, wasn't it possible he had family somewhere else? Children abroad? A wife somewhere? He had once hinted at all these things, though never in detail. People shrugged it off. But solitude has a way of breeding silence, and silence, in time, breeds questions. To understand Mr. John, one had to look past the walls he built, not just the tall concrete fence that surrounded his home, but the invisible walls that shielded his life from those around him. He had arrived in the community in 2017, a man already past 60. By then, he had seen the rise and fall of many chapters in his own story. He was born on October 1, 1955 in Nigeria. His life, in a way, mirrored the country's, full of promise, struggle, reinvention. 4 years, John worked as an engineer in Port Harcourt. The oil city was booming and he was part of that machine, building, repairing, overseeing. He had a family there once. Neighbors in Oyo would later recall hearing snatches of his story. A wife who stayed in port, children he rarely mentioned. They had separated, though the reasons were unclear. What was certain was that John was a man who kept moving. Before settling in Oyo, he had lived in different parts of the city, never forming lasting ties. When he finally built his house in the community, many assumed he wanted peace, a place to retreat as age caught up with him. The house itself was peculiar. Instead of building close to the gate like most people, John pushed the structure far to the back of his land, leaving an expanse of open space at the front. That empty space, in time, would become a wilderness of weeds. Neighbors tried to draw him into the community fold, but his appearances were rare. He attended the landlord's meeting only once. He never quarreled, never owed dues, and never caused trouble. To most, he was the perfect neighbor, quiet, invisible, self-contained. But behind his self-sufficiency, there were glimpses of vulnerability. Those who had worked for him, like Mr. Mola, a local handyman, remembered how cautious John was about his health. "Ah, this dust is too much," John once said, moving away as Mola mixed cement on the site. "At my age I cannot breathe this. My blood pressure will not allow it." He spoke often of his medications, vitamins, blood pressure tablets, herbal teas. He avoided smoke and heavy labor, choosing instead to supervise with a watchful eye. He was a man aware of his limits, protective of the years he had left. One evening, as Mola fixed something in his sitting room, John made a call to one of his daughters abroad. His voice softened as he spoke into the phone, switching between English and Yoruba, asking about her work, her studies, her health. Mola listened silently, struck by how animated John became when talking to her, a stark contrast to his usual reserve. Yes, John had family. But they were distant shadows, not part of his daily life in Oyo. To the people around him, he remained a man behind walls. And so, when he vanished at the end of 2019, the mystery was almost too easy to ignore. He was always coming and going. He was always alone. Who could say if this absence was unusual, or simply another chapter in his wandering life? The truth, however, was waiting behind that gate. The weeds were rising, the snakes were slithering, and silence was thickening inside his house. 4 years would pass before anyone dared to look inside, and by then it would be too late. The year 2020 dawned with unease. The Harmattan winds swept through Oyo, carrying dust that settled on zinc rooftops and coated every roadside plant. Children still ran about barefoot, their laughter ringing in the dry air, but whenever talk turned to Mr. John, a subtle hush would fall. He had not returned. At first, neighbors excused his absence. Perhaps he had extended his trip, some reasoned. Others believed he was living with his family elsewhere. After all, he had children in the United States and a wife somewhere in Port Harcourt. Who could blame an aging man for seeking comfort in familiar company? But the silence around his house was becoming unsettling. One evening at the small kiosk near the main junction, 2 women exchanged hushed words as they arranged tomatoes. "Have you seen Engineer lately?" one asked, wiping her hands on her wrapper. "No," the other replied. "His gate has been locked for months. Even his car, I haven't seen it driven out." The first woman frowned. "Do you think something happened to him?" Her companion shrugged. "People like him, they have families somewhere. Maybe he has gone back to them." But her voice trailed off uneasy. By mid-year the questions grew louder. Children who once kicked footballs near his gate now avoided it, whispering stories of ghosts. At night, the compound loomed like a shadow, the overgrowth of weeds pressing against the walls like a secret trying to escape. The most disturbing part was the phone. Those who once had his numbers tried calling, but the lines had long gone dead. No ringing tone. No voicemail. Just silence. Maybe he changed his SIM card, someone suggested during a casual conversation. Or maybe he doesn't want to be disturbed, another offered. But in their hearts, many sensed something was wrong. The bush around his compound thickened as though nature itself was conspiring to hide whatever truth lay inside. Tall grasses bent in the wind, crawling vines crept over the fence, and the once sharp edges of the iron gate began to rust. At night, the sound of crickets and frogs filled the air, broken occasionally by the hiss of snakes slithering in the dark. It was as though the compound had become alive, an untamed thing devouring its master. Yet even as whispers swirled, no one dared to act. By the end of 2020, the matter had grown urgent. It wasn't just gossip anymore, it was a problem. The bush spilling out of John's compound was no longer merely unsightly, it was dangerous. Snakes had begun slithering into nearby compounds, sending children screaming and mothers clutching brooms in terror. One afternoon, a green mamba was spotted crossing into a neighbor's kitchen. The household erupted in chaos until brave youths managed to kill it. That evening, a heated conversation sparked at the landlord's meeting. "Something must be done about Engineer's compound," one landlord declared, pounding his fist on the wooden table. "The bush is a hazard. Snakes are multiplying there. We cannot sit and watch." Heads nodded in agreement. Murmurs rose. But then came the hesitation. "How do we enter his compound?" another asked. "That is trespass. If his family shows up tomorrow and finds we broke in, they can sue us. Do we want police trouble?" Silence fell. Everyone knew the risks. The law was clear. Entering someone's property without consent was a violation. And John, though absent, was still the rightful owner. "But what if he is inside?" a bold voice asked. "What if something happened to him?" That question sent a shiver through the gathering. Eyes darted around, uneasy. "If something happened to him," one man replied carefully, "the authorities would have come by now. His people would have asked, 'Has anyone come here to ask for him?' The answer was no. No child. No wife. No relative. Nobody." It was almost as though the man had evaporated. Reluctantly, the meeting ended without action. The risk of breaking the law seemed heavier than the risk of snakes, and so the compound was left untouched. But the silence weighed on the community. Each time someone passed his house, they felt the chill of unfinished business. Some swore they saw strange lights flickering at night through the cracks of his window. Others claimed they heard whispers, though none dared to investigate. By 2021, the legend of the missing landlord had grown. New tenants moving into the community would ask, "Who lives in that house?" only to be told, "Nobody, or maybe somebody still does." The truth lay just beyond the walls, but fear, of law, of the unknown, kept everyone at bay. The bush grew taller, thicker. It was no longer a compound. It was a forest. And within it, a secret slept, waiting to be found. By 2021, time had dulled some of the urgency surrounding Mr. John's absence. His name was mentioned less frequently at gatherings, his compound avoided like a shrine. The bush had become a fixture of the community, a green fortress that seemed to whisper, "Do not disturb me." But everything changed when a new family moved into the empty plot beside his house. The land had long been vacant, an unkempt rectangle of earth waiting for a willing buyer. When construction finally began, the sound of hammers and cement mixers filled the air. The new owner, a businessman named Mr. Ken, supervised daily. His wife, cheerful and social, introduced herself to neighbors, and their 2 children quickly became familiar faces in the streets. For a while, the new house brought life and energy to that quiet corner of the community. But living next to John's compound soon revealed a darker side. It began with small encounters, lizards and rodents fleeing from the bush during construction. Then one humid evening, Ken's wife screamed as a snake slithered across their veranda. Neighbors rushed in, sticks in hand, and killed it. But that was only the beginning. Within weeks, the family's nights were disturbed by strange rustling from the bush. Frogs croaked incessantly, mosquitoes multiplied, and worse still, snakes kept finding their way into their compound. The children became afraid to play outside. Ken's wife began sleeping lightly, jumping at every sound. "This is not ordinary," she whispered one night as she pulled her husband aside. "We cannot live like this. That bush is dangerous." Ken, a practical man, nodded grimly. He had already noticed how the weeds in John's compound towered higher than the fence, spilling outward as though the land itself had been abandoned to nature. Each time he drove past, the sight unsettled him. He had never seen a landlord so absent, so careless. At the next landlord's meeting, Ken raised the issue. "My family cannot continue like this," he said firmly. "Snakes have entered my compound 3 times this month. That bush is breeding them. Something must be done." The elders exchanged uneasy glances. They remembered the last time the topic came up, the legal warnings, the reluctance to trespass. But Ken pressed on. "With all due respect, are we waiting for tragedy before we act? What if one of these snakes bites a child? Who will we blame then?" His words struck home. Parents shifted uncomfortably, picturing their children in danger. The murmur of agreement grew louder. But still, someone raised the old objection. "If we enter that house, the law can turn against us. It is still his property. We do not know if he is alive or dead. We must be careful." Ken leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Then let us go through the proper channel. Let us approach the police. If we have their backing, then no one can accuse us of wrongdoing." And so, for the first time in nearly 2 years, the silence surrounding Mr. John's compound began to crack. The police station was a modest building with faded paint and iron bars across its windows. When the delegation of landlords arrived, led by Ken and 2 elders, the officer on duty raised his brow. "What brings you here?" he asked, folding his arms. They explained the situation: the absent landlord, the abandoned compound, the bush that had become a breeding ground for reptiles. They spoke of the danger to children, the fear in the community, the urgent need to act. The officer listened silently, his face unreadable. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair. "This is not a simple matter," he said finally. "You are correct. Entering a man's property without permission can bring legal consequences. But if what you say is true, if the bush is endangering lives, then something must be done." He tapped his pen against the desk. "We cannot ignore this. But you will need approval from the divisional police officer. She alone can authorize such action." The following week, the landlords returned, this time meeting with the DPO herself. A formidable woman with sharp eyes, she listened intently as Ken described the problem. When he was done, she folded her hands on the desk. "It has been how long since this man was seen?" "Since late 2019, one elder replied. "And no one has come to ask for him?" "None," the elder said, shaking his head. The DPO's face hardened. That is troubling. But very well, you have my permission. You may clear the bush, but you must inform us immediately of anything unusual you find. Do not tamper with property inside the house. We will send officers if needed. Relief swept through the delegation. For the first time in years, the weight of uncertainty seemed lighter. They returned to the community with the news, and plans were quickly made. Laborers were hired, machetes sharpened, wheelbarrows prepared. The day was fixed for a Sunday morning, when most residents would be home to witness the work. Whispers ran through the neighborhood. Some children excitedly speculated about what might be found inside. Others warned one another not to get too close. Adults, though outwardly calm, felt a quiet dread. For too long Mr. John's house had been a sealed mystery. Now, at last, it would be opened. But none of them were prepared for what lay beyond that gate. The day the neighbors finally worked up the courage to break into Engineer Ben's compound began like any other in Appete. The sun rose hot and heavy, burning away the morning mist that hung over the unkempt grasses around the man's property. But unlike any other day, this one carried a weight in the air, a nervous energy among those who had gathered. The compound looked more like a jungle than a residence now. Trees leaned over the roof, their branches pressing against rusting corrugated sheets. Tall weeds brushed against the cracked walls, and reptiles slithered out of sight whenever the rustle of human footsteps broke the stillness. For 4 years no one had crossed that gate. For 4 years, it had been left to rot untouched, an eerie monument to silence. But the silence was becoming unbearable. The reptiles nesting inside had started invading neighboring compounds, entering kitchens and chicken coops, and even darting across verandas at night. Mothers whispered in fear that children would get bitten, and men cursed their own hesitation. Something had to be done. That day, a small group finally gathered with cutlasses, hoes, and sticks. They had no choice, they would clear the bush, law or no law. As the sound of blades hacking through wild growth echoed through the neighborhood, sweat poured down foreheads. The bush was thicker than expected, a tangle of stubborn weeds and vines that resisted every swing. Hours passed. Dust rose in the hot air. And with each strike, each thud, something deeper than sweat rolled down their backs, a creeping dread of what they might find. Then came the gate. It was chained shut, rust having eaten deep into the links. No one had the key, no one dared admit to even wanting it. The law forbade breaking into another's property, yet desperation had long since overtaken fear of punishment. A few men exchanged tense glances. Then one swung his cutlass hard against the lock. Metal rang out. Another blow followed. And another. Finally, with a sound like a groan, the chain snapped and the gate creaked open. The smell hit them first. It wasn't the sharp stench of fresh decay, time had long since stripped the flesh from bone, but it was there, faint and haunting, mixed with dust and dampness. The air inside the compound was heavy, stagnant, as though it had not been disturbed in years. Inside, the wildness was worse. Bushes stretched nearly to the windows. Lizards scattered. The house stood there, pale and lifeless, like a ghost at the center of its own graveyard. One neighbor muttered a prayer under his breath. Another clutched the cutlass tighter. Yet they pressed forward, step by step, until they reached the front door. It was locked. Of course it was locked. The key was nowhere to be found, and the handle rattled uselessly. For a long while, the men stood there, breathing hard, each silently wishing another would decide what to do next. Finally, someone kicked. The wood groaned. Another joined in. With a thunderous crack, the door gave way, swinging open into a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light of day. And there, in that darkness, the truth of Engineer Ben's fate waited. At first they hesitated. No one wanted to be the first to step inside. The air was thick with dust, carrying the smell of long abandonment, a mixture of mold, paper, and something older still. Their eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light filtering through cracked shutters, and shapes began to emerge. A sofa frozen in time, a table with untouched papers, a laptop sitting quietly as though waiting to be opened again. It was as if the room itself had held its breath for 4 long years. One of the younger men, braver, or perhaps more reckless, than the rest, stepped forward. His sandals crunched over dry debris on the floor. He motioned for the others to follow. Together they moved deeper into the house. Room after room told the same story. A wardrobe still filled with neatly arranged clothes. Shelves lined with books now gathering layers of dust. Bottles of medicine scattered across a nightstand, labels faded but still legible. Phones left behind, their batteries long dead. And in the corner of the sitting room, a flat-screen plasma television, untouched as though waiting for its owner to return and press the remote. But it was the bedroom that broke them. The door creaked open slowly as though resisting intrusion. Inside, the air grew colder, somehow heavier. And there, on the bed, lay the skeletal remains of Engineer Ben. He was stretched out as though he had gone to sleep and never awoke. The bones were stark against the tattered bedsheet, the skull tilted slightly to one side, empty sockets staring into the dimness. The sight froze them in place, hearts thundering, breaths short. For a long moment no one spoke. The silence was suffocating, filled only by the distant sound of birds calling outside, unaware of the horror unfolding within those walls. Finally, someone whispered a broken prayer. Another covered his face. A third backed away toward the door, muttering, "Yesu? Yesu," as though calling on God might erase the nightmare before them. It was a scene beyond comprehension. For years and no one had known. For years and he had lain there in his own home, forgotten by the world. Not robbed, not disturbed. His belongings intact. His car parked outside, gathering rust beneath the weeds. His life, frozen and left to decay. Word spread quickly through Appete. Neighbors, friends, and strangers gathered outside the compound, some pressing forward to glimpse the skeleton, others retreating in fear. The discovery was too much for many to process. Whispers rose and fell, each theory more disturbing than the last. Was he sick? Did anyone ever check on him? Where was his family? Why didn't anyone notice sooner? The questions piled up, but the answers were nowhere to be found. All they had was the grim truth before their eyes. A man who had once been a vibrant member of their community, reduced to bones on a bed, his story locked away in silence until nature itself forced it back into the light. By the time the police arrived, the crowd outside had swelled, murmurs spreading like wildfire. Officers pushed their way through, faces grim, and stepped into the house. They confirmed what the neighbors already knew. Engineer Ben was long dead, his remains skeletal, his time of death impossible to determine with precision. They carried what was left of him away, placing the bones into a bag, the sound of the zipper closing echoing like a final verdict. The compound was sealed off, but the image lingered. For the community of Appete, the sight of the skeleton on that bed became more than just a discovery. It became a haunting symbol of neglect, of silence, and of the mysteries that fester when questions go unasked for too long. The news spread like Harmattan fire. Before the police even cordoned off the house, people had begun pouring into Appete from nearby streets, drawn by the unbelievable tale. They found him, the engineer. He was there all along. In his own house. By the time dusk settled, the lane outside his compound looked like a market square. Men leaned on their motorcycles, muttering theories. Women with wrappers tied tight around their waists whispered into each other's ears. Children peered from behind legs, too curious to stay away, too afraid to step closer. And in the middle of it all, the compound stood silent again, its gate shut, its secrets half revealed. An elderly woman, her face etched with wrinkles that carried both wisdom and sorrow, shook her head. "Ah, and to think I used to greet him every morning. Always, 'Good morning, Mama,' he would say. Quiet man. Kept to himself. Who would believe he has been lying there all this while?" Another neighbor chimed in, voice heavy with guilt. "We heard nothing. Not even a cry for help. Could it be that he was already sick? Maybe the sickness carried him quietly in the night." But a younger man, bitterness rising in his tone, cut in sharply. "Sickness? Or maybe we just failed him. For years, and nobody thought to break that gate. We left him there like an abandoned dog. Now see what we found." The crowd fell silent at that. Because it was true. The shame of neglect clung to them all. They had lived beside him day after day, watching the bush swallow his house, watching the silence deepen. And yet, nobody had pushed far enough. Fear of the law, respect for privacy, whispers that he travels often, or his children are abroad. Excuses upon excuses. Now all that remained was bone. When the officers left with the remains, they had left the rooms untouched, at least for the neighbors who dared to peek in before the house was locked up again. A few women claimed they saw the bed where he lay, the way the skull seemed to face the door as though waiting for visitors who never came. Others swore they noticed a bottle of medication still by his bedside, half finished, like an interrupted ritual. One man, a tailor who lived across the street, gave his account in a trembling voice. "I followed them inside when they carried the skeleton out. God forgive me, but curiosity pushed me." His laptop was still on the table, covered in dust. His shoes were neatly placed under the bed, as if he would wear them again in the morning. Even his television was still there, not touched by thieves. Only God knows how he died. These fragments of memory painted a chilling picture. The house wasn't looted. The locks hadn't been broken. Everything was intact. Which meant whatever took him, it was not violence from outside. It happened quietly within those walls. As night deepened, theories multiplied like moths around a lantern. Some said he had been ill for years and in his solitude, death crept in and swallowed him without witness. Others insisted darker forces were at play. One voice whispered, "Do you know he once quarreled with his wife before she left? What if?" Another added fuel. "Ah, but did you hear? He had children abroad, but none came to check? Not even once? What kind of children are those?" The whispers grew louder. Fingers pointed at those absent. His family, his estranged wife, the children across oceans. But others defended them. Maybe they had lost touch, maybe they never knew how serious his sickness was, maybe letters never arrived. Still, suspicion hung in the air like smoke. By the second day after the discovery, shock had hardened into restless unease. The compound was sealed, the body taken to the morgue. Yet the crowd still lingered outside, unable to tear themselves away from the haunting mystery. Everyone waited for his family, any family, to appear. But none came. It was said he had once been married, that his wife had left after a long separation. Some recalled her visiting years ago, her figure standing at the gate, her voice raised in argument before fading from their lives. She was gone now, her whereabouts uncertain. As for the children, the stories varied. Some swore he had 2 daughters studying overseas. Others believed he had a son in Abuja, working quietly in government service. But none of them came forward, none reached out, none appeared at the morgue to claim his remains. The silence was deafening. At the roadside, a mechanic raised his voice. Family or no family, how could he die like that without anyone looking for him? If my father doesn't call me for 1 week, I will go and check him. But 4 years? For years. Those children have failed him. A woman selling groundnuts nearby shook her head sorrowfully. Maybe they didn't know. A broad life can swallow people. But still, at least his wife. Even if you separate, does it mean you forget? He was her husband. Others disagreed violently. Don't blame only them. We too failed. Were we not his neighbors? We saw his house rot. We saw the bush cover his car. Did we raise alarm? No. We folded our arms. The arguments spiraled late into the night, until even those most vocal grew weary. Because the truth, bitter and unavoidable, was that everyone had failed him in one way or another. Family, friends, neighbors, community. His death had slipped through cracks too wide to mend. In the weeks that followed, his house became a landmark of dread. People slowed their steps when passing by, eyes darting toward the shuttered windows. Some claimed they heard strange noises at night, soft thuds, whispers in the grass, the echo of footsteps. Children dared each other to run up to the gate and touch it, only to scream and run back laughing nervously. But laughter never lasted. The house was too heavy, too haunted by memory. It reminded everyone of their own silence, their own hesitation. And somewhere, far away, perhaps his family carried on with their lives, unaware, or unwilling to confront, the story unfolding around his remains. Perhaps one day they would return. Or perhaps the skeleton on the bed would be all the community ever had to remember him by. The morning after his remains were carried away, the compound was quieter than it had been in years. No chatter of neighbors. No hum of machetes slicing through bush. Just silence. Yet that silence carried weight, like an invisible crowd still lingering, reluctant to leave. The police had urged the community to wait for relatives before any burial arrangements could be made. But waiting in itself became another torment. Mr. Mola, the man who had first peered into the window and discovered the skeleton, was still shaken when reporters and curious outsiders began arriving. His voice cracked as he spoke. We only knew fragments. He said his children were in America. He mentioned a wife once, but we never saw her. We don't even know where she is now. Imagine, living next to a man and knowing so little about him. That is the hardest part. A few landlords volunteered to help the police trace relatives. Old contacts were scoured. Numbers dialed. But his phones had long died, and the dust-covered laptop yielded nothing at first glance. The world he carried in his devices had gone silent with him. Some swore they once heard him call a daughter abroad, speaking warmly on the phone. That faint memory now became the sole thread of hope. Police said they would check immigration records, try to trace kin. But until then, his body lay cold in the morgue, a man without a family to claim him. While officials searched, the community took matters into their own hands. On the third evening after his discovery, they gathered with lanterns and candles outside his house. Men, women, children, all stood in a half-circle, murmuring prayers into the humid night. The vigil wasn't planned. It was born of guilt. Mama Grace, the elderly woman who used to greet him, wept quietly. "If only I had knocked harder, if only I had asked more questions." Another neighbor added, "We thought he had traveled and we left it there. Now see how we are gathered. May his spirit forgive us." The vigil grew as word spread. Songs rose, slow hymns carried by voices thick with regret. For a man who had rarely joined their gatherings in life, the community now stood united in mourning him. Somewhere in the shadows, children whispered ghost stories, that his spirit still sat on the bed where they found him, waiting to see if his children would come. The adults silenced them quickly, but even the grown-ups felt uneasy. Because in truth, the ghost they all feared wasn't in the house. It was in themselves, the ghost of neglect, the haunting knowledge that they could have prevented years of silence. By the end of the week, journalists from Ibadan and even Lagos had descended on the sleepy neighborhood. They asked relentless questions. How could no one notice for 4 years? Didn't anyone hear or smell anything? What does this say about modern life, where neighbors live side by side yet remain strangers? Microphones were thrust into faces. Cameras flashed at the compound's gate. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion, everyone remembered a detail. One man insisted, "I saw him last in 2019. He told me he was traveling. That is why I never suspected anything. He was a man of few words." Another countered, "We should have acted sooner." The bush kept growing. "We saw reptiles crawling. That was not normal. We should not have waited for the police's approval. Law or no law, human life is more important." But the police officers themselves were defensive. They told reporters, "The community came to us more than once. We advised caution. We cannot just allow people to break into private property. We waited for enough reason." Unfortunately, by then the man had long passed. Every statement contradicted the other, and yet all pointed back to the same conclusion. Too little, too late. By the time the body was formally claimed, by distant relatives traced weeks later, the story had already become legend. In markets, motor parks, and roadside conversations across Oyo State, people retold it with disbelief. A landlord, gone for years, only to be found in his own bedroom as a skeleton. It became more than a tale. It became a mirror. For neighbors, the discovery reshaped how they looked at one another. Now, when days passed without seeing someone, knocks grew louder, questions sharper. Nobody wanted another Mr. John on their conscience. One young man, still shaken, said in an interview, "It is a warning. We are too isolated now. Everyone minds their business. But see where that has led us. What is the use of living among people if we live as strangers?" Churches in the area used the story as sermons. Check on your neighbor. Ask after the elderly. Do not assume. Even radio stations debated it. Have we lost our communal spirit? Has modern life made us blind to each other's suffering? Those who saw the body never forgot it. The skeleton on the bed. The undies still clinging faintly to the waist. The skull with a gap-toothed grin as though mocking their delayed concern. The untouched TV. The dust-laden medicines, silent witnesses to his final struggle. For some, the image returned in dreams. For others, it surfaced in quiet moments, while cooking, while walking past his gate, while sweeping their compounds. It wasn't just the sight of death, it was the sight of solitude, magnified to its most terrifying conclusion. Months later, the bush had been cleared, the compound sealed again. Life moved on as it always does. Yet the story lingered. Children still pointed whenever they walked past. That is where the skeleton man was found. Adults grew more cautious, reminding each other not to let history repeat itself. And in unspoken ways, Mr. John changed them. His silence became a call to action. His lonely death became a communal oath, to watch, to listen, to notice. The tragedy of Mr. John was not just that he died. It was that he died unseen. His last breath carried away in a room full of belongings, yet empty of witnesses. But in the end, his story traveled farther than he ever did in life. It forced a community, a state, and perhaps a nation, to confront the quiet dangers of neglect. The echoes of his silence remind us all, in a world where walls grow higher and neighbors turn into strangers, sometimes the simplest act, knocking on a door, asking a question, checking in, can be the difference between life and death.